The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive is a legal revolution that will change the rules of globalization. Let me first remind you the current situation. The rule today is rather simple. There is no rules. Multinational companies selling products in Europe are not producing anything themselves. They are externalizing their production to multiple subsidiaries in their value chain in China or anywhere else in the world. They do not produce anything and hence they are not responsible for any negative impact the production processes and their activities might have on people or the environment. And still, they are the ones making all the profits from the production and the sales of their products. I usually call this a pyramid of irresponsibility. The goal of this directive is to put an end to this unregulated and unfair globalization, to stop impunity and to create accountability for big multinationals. Once adopted, this European legislation will be enforced on all big companies selling products in the EU, no matter whether they are European firms or not. We, citizens and lawmakers in Europe, decide that we cannot longer tolerate that private companies make profit at the expense of people's rights and environmental rights all across the world. And our decision will trigger a big shift in the ways factories are run, workers are treated, natural resources are protected or not in the whole world. This is why this legislation, this directive, is so crucial. The Due Diligence Directive will create obligations for companies to know and monitor their entire value chain. Companies will have to map their operations and those of their business partners in order to identify where potential adverse impacts are more likely to occur. Then they will have to take measures to prevent these impacts and mitigate them where prevention is not possible. Where impacts are already occurring, companies will have to bring these impacts to an end. For identifying the impacts, designing and implementing the required plans and measures, companies will have to consult affected stakeholders in their value chain. These are the workers, trade unions, local communities, NGOs. And where negative impacts on human rights or the environment cannot be brought to an end. For instance, in cases of systemic and state-imposed forced labor in China, where individual companies do not have the leverage to impulse change on the ground, then the big companies will have the obligation to terminate their contracts and leave. In addition to this, where big companies have caused harm to victims, they will have to provide for remediations. The other way this directive will ensure that businesses respect human rights and environment is with deterrence. Big companies which do not respect their obligation pursuant to the directive will be imposed administrative sanctions. These are pecuniary penalties calculated on the basis of the company worldwide turnover. Sanctions can go up to 5% of the global turnover of companies. Finally, the most revolutionary novelty in this legislation is the ability for victims of human rights violation or of destruction of the environment to hold companies liable of the damage caused. Victims will be able to bring actions to European courts and claim full compensation for the damages caused. This civil liability part is a real victory for justice and accountability of big companies across the world. Most visible cases of violation of fundamental rights are, for instance, child labor in mines or other extractive industries, infringement of workers' rights in the construction sector, let's say in Qatar, where workers are prevented from leaving the buildings, their passports are confiscated, and they are not receiving a decent living income. Violation of freedom of association and right to collective bargaining in countries where workers are not allowed to form trade unions, like in Belarus, Myanmar, or Guatemala, for instance. Cases where private companies unlawfully evict local groups or indigenous communities from their lands to develop their production site or use the natural resources, or enslave Uyghur people on the production of polysilicium for solar panels or cotton harvesting for multinationals of textiles. When it comes to environmental issues, companies can be responsible for the destruction of natural resources such as water pollution, air pollution, harmful emissions or degradation of lands or deforestation, the use of chemicals, pesticides, or other controlled substances prohibited in Europe in their manufacturing processes, or the import of endangered species to our market. It is true that this new legislation will require the suppliers and subsidiaries of big companies in Europe to change their practices and behavior. This is even the core objective of this directive. So there is a risk, yes, that parent companies impose new requirements on smaller businesses partners in the global south without giving them the full support and resources to meet this new obligation. So to mitigate this risk and to prevent such unfair situations, the directive requires parent companies to support their partners in this process, in particular in adapting their own business models and strategies, including employment, procurement, purchasing, and pricing practices. This is also a way to prevent that parent companies simply transfer the cost and the burden of due diligence obligation to their partners further down to the value chain. Another possible adverse impact for stakeholders in the global south could arise from situations where companies decide to disengage and terminate their relationship with a partner in the global south. Indeed, such disengagement can have really negative impact on workers' communities whose incomes and resources rely on their position in the factory. This is why the termination of contracts is limited to situations of state-organized violations that cannot be reversed through mitigation and discussion. Finally, in order to provide support for companies on how to fulfill their due diligence obligation and for stakeholders globally, the European Commission will publish multiple guidelines. For too long, we have considered trade as an end in itself, while it should be considered only as a tool to serve very important objectives. And these objectives are sustainable development, decarbonation of our economies, respect for human and social rights, promotion of democracies and principles that are basic to the European Union. We should, through incentives and bans, orient trade towards these goals and finally use our market power for reaching long-term goals that are benefiting both the developing countries and the European citizens.